Good morning. We're continuing this morning our introduction to Reformed Baptist Covenant Theology, lesson 6, which is our second lesson on the Abrahamic Covenant. Quick review, we had an introductory lesson where we looked at the different aspects and elements of covenants. And we covered the covenant of works. We've seen that all men are born in sin because they're fallen and guilty in Adam. And then we looked at the first gospel proclamation in Genesis 3:15 and recognized that the same gospel that we have today is the only gospel that has ever saved anyone. No one's ever been saved by anything other than trusting the Messiah. The Old Testament saints did not have the clear proclamation of the gospel that we do, and yet they were still saved by trusting in the Messiah who is to come. Then I had somebody pointed out to me in our lesson on choices and clarifications, and I said there are two primary yet differing ways in which Reformed Baptists understand covenant theology. And I referred to one as 1689 federalism, which is the position by which we'll be looking at these things. And I referred to the other as the substance administration view. And the reason I call it the substance administration view is because, according to this view, all of the Old Testament covenants are in substance the covenant of grace, just like the new covenant, but the things that differ in them are merely outward administration. What I want to make clear is when I reject saying that's not the direction we're going, I'm not saying that there is no distinction between the substance of a covenant and the administration of a covenant. I'm not saying that, so please don't hear that. I'm saying that the Old Testament covenants are not, in substance, the covenant of grace, but they are subservient covenants to the covenant of grace, which is the new covenant. I just wanted to make that clarification because there are some people who get upset if you don't. There is a difference between substance and administration, but we don't need to dig into what that is exactly. Then we looked at the Noahic covenant. We saw that the kingdom of creation, because of the covenant fall and the covenant of works, is a common cursed kingdom of common grace. And the Noahic covenant is promised preservation for the sake of the fulfillment of all of God's promises, and all mankind benefits from that kindness and common grace. It does include commands, but the benefit of the covenant is not dependent upon obedience. So we looked at the kingdom of creation under the covenant of works of the Noahic covenant. And last week we started looking at the kingdom of Israel as established by the Abrahamic covenant. And Renahan says, up to this point, the nation of Israel did not exist. Its progenitors existed. There was no formal or official recognition of the nation that we know as Israel. Nor was there one particular people recognized as the people of God. Neither was there one particular place recognized as the land of such a people. The Israelite kingdom was established by covenants through which God delegated dominion over Canaan to Abraham and his descendants. This began with the Abrahamic covenant. We saw that the Abrahamic covenant is progressively revealed. We only got a little over halfway through the revelation of the Abrahamic covenant last week. We'll finish up Abraham today. And then next week, we'll look at Abraham as it's extended through Isaac and Jacob. And we recognize the seed of Abraham is all through these promises. There's so much about the seed of Abraham. And we saw that's fulfilled in three ways. They're the physical descendants of Abraham, the nation through whom the Messiah will come. But the seed, especially when Paul looks at it, he says it's seed, not seeds. So the ultimate fulfillment of these things is through the Messiah himself as the promised seed. And then the spiritual seed of Abraham are those who embrace the Messiah as Abraham did. And then we noted that all of God's covenant dealings from this point forward have reference to Abraham. So we just started walking through. We saw in Genesis 12, 1 through 3, and promises, I will make you a great nation. We notice this is spoken to a 75-year-old man with a barren wife. But we saw the federal headship there. All those who will be in this covenant will be so by virtue of their relationship to Abraham. Said there that he will make his name great and make him a blessing. And then Genesis 12:7, Lord appeared to Abraham and said to your descendants, I will give this land. So first, I will make you a great nation. Now he expands it. I will give them this land. Genesis 13:1, to the place of the altar which you have made there at first. And there Abram called on the name of the Lord. So we see Abram didn't start calling on the name of the Lord clear 10 years later when it says that he was justified by faith. He's had this faith, and it's persevering faith over the years. In 13:14 through 17, even though Abraham had just divided the land with Lot, God promised it all to Abraham. And he says that I will make your seed as the dust of the earth, so that if a man could number the dust of the earth, then your seed could also be numbered. So he keeps expanding these promises about the nation through whom the Messiah would come. In chapter 14, 18 through 20, we saw Melchizedek was a type of Christ. He's a king of Salem, which means king of peace. He's a priest and a king. We know as Abraham was not God's only faithful servant when God was making these dealings with him. And Genesis 15, 4 through 5, where the Lord came to him saying, this one shall not be your heir. He said, Eliezer of Damascus, a servant in my household, is my heir, and you've promised me all these things. How are they going to happen? He said, this one won't be your heir, but one who comes from your own body shall be your heir. And he brought him outside and said, look toward heaven and count the stars, if you are able to number them. So shall your seed be. So he expanded it. One from your own body is through whom this nation is going to come, and they will be as numerous as the stars of the sky. And then Genesis 15:6. He believed in the Lord, and he accounted to him for righteousness. This was not Abraham's conversion. He had been walking with the Lord for 10 years. But the faith that Abraham had for 10 years was a justifying faith. Genesis 15:19 through 21, we saw the covenant ceremony. In 13 through 16, the Egyptian captivity is foretold. So we saw that the Abrahamic covenant anticipates the Mosaic covenant. And in 17 through 21, God represents himself as passing between the pieces. So when he did that, he is saying, let me be cut in two if I do not bring these promises to pass. And again, he repeated, to your seed I have given this land. And in 17:1 through 8, God appeared to Abraham when he was 99 years old. There had been a 13-year-old gap. He's not making a new covenant. He's just expanding the covenant he's already begun with Abraham. He told him he would multiply him exceedingly. He expanded the promises, verse 4. As for me, behold, my covenant is with you, and you shall be the father of many nations. And we saw how that is fulfilled in the calling of the Gentiles in Romans 4:16 through 17. And then I think we ended with we got a little bit past that. We saw that God changed his name from Abram to Abraham, from exalted father to father of a multitude. And he had the promise of kings. The nation through whom the Messiah would come would be governed by their own kings. And again, he repeated the land promise. Then in 17:7 through 8, he said, I will establish my covenant between me and you and your seed after you in their generations for an everlasting covenant to be a God to you and to your seed after you. Also, I give to you and to your seed after you the land in which you are a stranger, all the land of Canaan as an everlasting possession, and I will be their God. Okay, so the promise here, this is, and I brought an example of a typical Paedo-Baptist arguing that this promise, I will be their God and they shall be my people, is a salvific promise. That's proof that this is actually the covenant of grace. We saw that the promise here that they will be his people cannot be a promise of salvation, because if it were so, the promise would be false. I mean, just take for one generation as an example, the example of those who came out of Israel, or came out of Egypt by Moses. God redeemed them out of the land of Egypt. They were his people, and yet the vast majority of them fell in the wilderness as examples of unbelief. They were indeed his people, but not in the salvific sense. They were his people in a sense that was typical of the sense in which we are his people if we have faith in Christ. They were his people in such a way that when Christ, that is God incarnate, came to them, he came to his own, and his own did not receive him. John 1:11. Okay, now we're going to continue. That was a review of last week's. I think this is our longest. We're going to start out in Genesis 17, 9 through 14, where we have circumcision brought in. Genesis 17, 9 through 14. And God said to Abraham, "As for you, you shall keep my covenant, you and your descendants after you throughout their generations. This is my covenant, which you shall keep between me and you and your descendants after you. Every male child among you shall be circumcised, and you shall be circumcised in the flesh of your foreskins, and it shall be a sign of the covenant between me and you. He who is 8 days old among you shall be circumcised, every male child in your generations. He who is born in your house or bought with your money from any foreigner who is not your descendant. He who is born in your house, he who is bought with your money, must be circumcised. And my covenant shall be in your flesh for an everlasting covenant. And the uncircumcised male child who is not circumcised in the flesh of his foreskin, that person shall be cut off from his people. He has broken my covenant." So what do we see here? We see the promise that in Abraham all the nations of the earth will be blessed. The Messiah of all mankind is going to come through his loins. And so God places the sign of the covenant on the male reproductive organ. It's uncomfortable to talk about, but it's what God did. It does seem strange. He puts the sign of the covenant on something that's always covered up. It has meaning. He puts the sign of the covenant on the male reproductive organ because the greatest promise in this covenant is that Messiah is going to come through his loins. And it also has a sanction. He who does not cut off his foreskin will be cut off from his people. And this is key. What puts you in this covenant is your relationship to Abraham. He was born in your house, who he was bought with your money, must be circumcised. Greg, I mean, this is something interesting. I mean, this is something that the Paedo Baptists had to argue about for a while, because Abraham's commanded to circumcise his slaves. But we don't see anyone else doing that afterwards. So the Presbyterian slave owners are like, are we supposed to be baptizing our slaves? And they decided, no, we're not. Because it was only these in Abraham's house, because of their direct relationship to Abraham, who are to be circumcised. The whole key, what puts you in this covenant, is your relationship to Abraham. And we come to verses 15 and 16 in Genesis 17. Sarai becomes Sarah. God said to Abraham, "As for Sarai, your wife, you shall not call her Sarai, but Sarah shall be her name. And I will bless her, and also give you a son by her. Then I will bless her, and she shall be a mother of nations. Kings of peoples shall come from her." So he said, Sarai meant my princess. Sarah means princess of a multitude. So it's really very parallel to changing Abram to Abraham. And the promise is that there will be a son that comes through her. and he will bless many nations, and kings will come from her. So we have the repeated promise of kings. So we see here, it's really anticipating the Davidic covenant. So you see clear back here in Abraham, we see the anticipation of both the Mosaic covenant and the Davidic covenant. And in verses 17 and 18, Abraham fell on his face and laughed and said in his heart, shall a child be born to a man who is 100 years old? And shall Sarah, who is 90 years old, bear a child? And Abraham said to God, oh, that Ishmael might live before you. We see Abraham's first reaction is to fall on his face and laugh. And I think this can easily be misunderstood. He's not laughing because he doesn't believe it. He's laughing because he does believe it. I can't believe you're going to do this. It's so crazy. It's basically the situation. But he loves Ishmael, and he pleads for Ishmael. Oh, that the covenant would come through Ishmael. God, you've given me a son, Ishmael. Let the covenant be through him. But in verses 19 through 21, we see Isaac is named and Ishmael is rejected. Then God said, no, Sarah, your wife, shall bear you a son, and you shall call his name Isaac. I will establish my covenant with him for an everlasting covenant, and with his descendants after him. And as for Ishmael, I have heard you. Behold, I have blessed him, and will make him fruitful, and will multiply him exceedingly. He shall beget 12 princes, and I will make him a great nation. But my covenant I will establish with Isaac, whom Sarah shall bear to you at this set time next year. So he predicts next year you're going to have the son. His name will be Isaac, and the covenant will be established through him. Yeah, so Abraham was commanded to circumcise everyone in his household, including Ishmael, and yet Ishmael is rejected from the covenant, and Isaac is not. Isaac is him through whom the covenant is made. So he says, no, Sarah, your wife, will bear you a son. I will establish my covenant with him for an everlasting covenant, and his seed after him. Ishmael will be blessed, but God's covenant is with Isaac. God's covenant is not with Ishmael. Then in verses 22 through 27, then he finished talking with him, and God went up from Abraham. So Abraham took Ishmael his son, all who were born in his house, and all who were bought with his money, every male among the men of Abraham's house, and circumcised the flesh of their foreskins that very same day, as God had said to him. Abraham was 99 years old when he was circumcised in the flesh of his foreskin, and Ishmael his son was 13 years old when he was circumcised in the flesh of his foreskin. That very same day, Abraham also was circumcised, and his son Ishmael. And all the men of his house, born in his house or bought with money from a foreigner, were circumcised with him. So, circumcision is a sign of God's covenant with Abraham, and it is given to those due to their relationship to Abraham. Once again, Ishmael is rejected from the covenant, and yet he is still circumcised. It's something I'd really like to see somebody dig into. But we don't have time. Okay, now I want you to turn to Romans 4. This is very important. And I want to, my main point that I'm going to make here, I haven't seen anyone else make it. So I don't want to think, oh, this is the 1689 federalism thing. I haven't seen anyone else argue against it either, but it's very common. Your typical Paedo-Baptist will say circumcision was the sign and seal of the old covenant. Therefore, baptism is the sign and seal of the new covenant. Well, where does this term seal come from, and what does it mean? And I used to, when I was first learning covenant theology, I would say baptism is the sign and seal of the new covenant, but I don't think it's a seal, and here's why. Let's look at this passage, because I think it's exegetically very clear what a seal was and who it was a seal for. Okay, so Romans 4, 9 through 12. Does this blessedness then come upon the circumcised only, or upon the uncircumcised also? For we say that faith was accounted to Abraham for righteousness. How then was it accounted? While he was circumcised or while uncircumcised? Not while circumcised, but while uncircumcised. And he received the sign of circumcision, a seal of the righteousness of the faith which he had while still uncircumcised, that he might be the father of all those who believe, though they are uncircumcised, that righteousness might be imputed to them also. And the father of circumcision to those who are not only of the circumcision, but who also walk in the steps of faith which our father Abraham had while he was still uncircumcised. So here's where that term seal comes from with regard to circumcision. It says it is a seal of the righteousness of faith which he had while he was still uncircumcised. What is a seal? A seal authenticates something. When you get a seal on a packaged food that it's sealed, this is organic, or this is grass-fed beef, or whatever. It's a seal of the authentication of something. What does it say here that circumcision is a seal of? It is a seal of the righteousness of the faith which Abraham had. So, can this be said of anyone who was circumcised after that? Okay? Abraham, anyone born a descendant of Abraham would be circumcised on the eighth day. Was God setting a seal on that 8-day-old infant saying he has authentic faith in the Messiah? Of course not. That's ridiculous. It was a seal of the righteousness of faith, but only for Abraham. What this passage is saying isn't that circumcision is a seal of the old covenant. It is saying God made the covenant of circumcision with Abraham specifically because Abraham's faith is authentic faith. If anyone wants to know what kind of faith saves, they look to Abraham. That's the kind of faith that saves. So, I don't get upset when I hear somebody say baptism is a sign and seal of the new covenant, or circumcision was a sign and seal of the old covenant. It's not something to get upset about, but I don't think it's something we should use. So yes, baptism is a sign of the new covenant. Circumcision was a sign of the old covenant, but it was a seal. Circumcision was a seal only for Abraham. Does that make sense before I move on? Pastor Ryan.
But as a Reformed Baptist, we believe that we're only going to baptize those who have faith. So in a sense, our understanding of baptism, in a sense, a seal of somebody's faith in Christ.
I guess we could say that baptism is a seal not from God, but from the church. When we're baptizing someone, we're saying we believe this person has authentic faith in Jesus Christ. So in that sense, I think we could say it's a seal. But God's not saying that, because let's face it, we baptize people that aren't genuine believers. It looks authentic to us, but God knows those who are not true believers. And so, yeah, I guess we could say it's a church's seal, but it's not God's seal, because it's a fact. We do baptize some people who don't have genuine faith. Okay, let's move on. Oh,
just can we, picking up on that, can we then maybe look at it like, as we look at the visible and invisible church, that the seal of somebody being in the visible church is baptism. The seal of someone being in the invisible church is the Spirit.
Yeah. Which we'll get into more of that stuff when we get to the new covenant. But I don't think we should just throw out the terminology of sign and seal, because I mean, this is where seal comes from, and it was only true of Abraham. Well, and I guess it could have been, if anyone who truly, anyone out from outside of Israel who came and became a Jew, as their religion was trusting a Messiah to come, who was genuinely trusting the Messiah. But it's the fact that the thing that Paul is pointing out here is that God made the covenant with circumcision specifically with Abraham as a seal, recognizing that his faith was genuine saving faith. So I'd say that he's the father of us all. All of us who are truly trusting in Christ are the seed of Abraham because we have the same faith of Abraham, which joins us to the seed of Abraham. Okay, moving on. Okay. Genesis 21, 1 through 7. We won't read it for the sake of time, but we see there the promise is fulfilled and Isaac is born. Abraham obeys God and circumcises Isaac, and it happens when he's 100 years old. Genesis 21, 8. Isaac is weaned, and they have a feast to celebrate. So the child grew and was weaned, and Abraham made a great feast on the same day that Isaac was weaned. Then in verses 9 through 13, Ishmael scoffs and is cast out. So we see Ishmael scoffing at Isaac on the day he was weaned, and God casts him out for it. It's not simply, okay, yeah, of course it's common for big brothers to scoff their little brothers. It seems like it's not that big of a deal, right? Well, here's the fact: Isaac is the promised seed. He wasn't just scoffing at his little brother, he's scoffing at God's promises. We see in this passage, Ishmael scoffs. Abraham did love Ishmael, but God tells him to cast them out. And he again says, in Isaac your seed shall be called. Ishmael is also his seed and will be blessed, but he is rejected from the covenant. And we see Ishmael cries out in chapter 21, verses 14 to 21. Ishmael cries out, and God hears the cry of the lad and promises Hagar that he will become a great nation. Then verses 22 to 34, Abraham makes a covenant with Abimelech. We see in this passage a covenant between men. It's an oath-bound promise, and that we see the token or sign of the covenant were 7 ewe lambs. But that brings us to Genesis 22, where God tests Abraham. So the test begins verse 1. Now it came to pass after these things that God tested Abraham and said to him, Abraham. And he said, Here I am. Then he said, Take now your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah, and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains of which I will tell you. So he says, take your only son Isaac. The only here doesn't mean he's the only son in the sense we think. He has a brother. He's not the only son, but he's the only son in that he's the son of the promise. Offer him there as a burnt offering. And that's okay. It's commonly, when this passage comes up, people are just, well, atheists like to say, how could God command the sacrifice of a man? How wicked of a God this is. What we need to recognize when we look at this passage, this is a test of Abraham's faith. Does Abraham truly believe that God has promised, I will make you a great nation. They'll be as the sand of the seas, the star of the skies. The Messiah is going to come through this nation, and it's all going to start with Isaac. And now when Isaac is a young man, he isn't married, hasn't had any children, God says, kill him. Is he going to trust God and obey God? He has to do both, and that's the test. We see Abraham's prompt obedience in verses 3 through 4. Abraham rose early in the morning and saddled his donkey and took 2 of his young men with him and Isaac his son, and he split the wood for the burnt offering and rose and went to a place which God had told him. And on the 3rd day, Abraham lifted his eyes and saw the place far off. In verses 5 through 7, we see Isaac's question. Abraham said to his young men, "Stay here with the donkey. The lad and I will go yonder and worship, and we will come back to you." So Abraham took the wood of the burnt offering and laid it on Isaac his son, and he took the fire in his hand and the knife, and the 2 of them went together. But Isaac spoke to Abraham his father and said, "My father." And he said, "Here I am, my son." And he said, "Look, the fire and the wood, but where is the lamb for the burnt offering?" Now notice first, back in verse 5, Abraham already says, "We will come back to you." He's going, just he and Isaac, he's going to sacrifice Isaac, and yet he says, "We will come back to you." So in Hebrews 11:19, we'll look at it. Well, let's just read it. Hebrews 11:19, concluding that God was able to raise him even from the dead, from which he also received him in a figurative sense. This was Abraham's thought process. God has promised to give me a nation through this son. He hasn't even had any children yet. He's commanded me to sacrifice him. Therefore, he must be going to raise him from the dead. That's Abraham's conclusion. This is why Abraham's faith is the example of saving faith. We see some people think faith is blind belief in spite of the facts. No, but true faith is thinking faith. He thought this through. God's promised me these things, therefore he must be going to do this, and I'm going to obey him. And we also notice Isaac is a young man. He's not an infant. Abraham's answer to his son, verses 8 through 10. Abraham said, "My son, God will provide for himself the lamb for a burnt offering." So the 2 of them went together, and they came to the place of which God had told him. And Abraham built an altar there and placed the wood in order. And he bound Isaac his son and laid him on the altar upon the wood. And Abraham stretched out his hand and took the knife to slay his son. So first he answers that God will provide the offering. Then he binds him on the altar, and he stretches out his hand to offer up his son. Then we get to verses 11 through 14. But the angel of the Lord called to him from the heaven and said, "Abraham, Abraham." So he said, "Here I am." And he said, "Do not lay your hand on the lad or do anything to him, for now I know that you fear God, since you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me." Then Abraham lifted his eyes and looked, and there behind him was a ram caught in the thicket by its horns. So Abraham went and took the ram and offered it up for a burnt offering instead of his son. And Abraham called the name of the place, "The Lord will provide," as it is said to this day, "In the mount of the Lord it shall be provided." So Abraham passes the test. God says, "Now I know that you fear God." Obviously, it's not that God gained knowledge. He already knew Abraham's heart. But Abraham has given the proof. It's evident to us, really. That's what's provided. It's evident to us that Abraham truly believed God. And you have the substitutionary atonement typified in this as well. Hebrews 11:17 through 19, speaking of this, is by faith Abraham, when he was tested, offered up Isaac, and he who had received the promises offered up his only begotten son, of whom it is said, "In Isaac your seed shall be called," concluding that God was able to raise him up even from the dead, from which he also received him in a figurative sense. We hear the Bible clearly seeing that God uses figures to teach lessons, and the figure in a figurative sense, this ram was provided a substitutionary atonement. And we see again, Abraham's faith was a thinking, believing, obeying faith. And that's followed by God's final expression of God's covenant promises to Abraham, verses 15 through 18. Then an angel of the Lord called to Abraham a second time out of heaven and said, "By myself I have sworn, says the Lord, because you have done this thing and have not withheld your son, your only son. Blessing, I will bless you. Multiplying, I will multiply your seed as the stars of heaven, as the sand of the seashore. He shall possess the gate of his enemies. And in your seed, all the nations of the earth shall be blessed, because you have obeyed my voice." So first we see here, he says, because you've done this thing and not withheld your son, because you've obeyed my voice, the following things. There weren't previous, if you do this, then I will make my covenant with you. But now he does, the fact that his faith was an obedient faith is the reason he is blessing him in this way. It is why he is the father of the faithful, because his faith is the example of faith we're all to follow. He says, blessing, I will bless you, multiply, I will multiply you as the stars of the heaven and the sand on the seashore. We have this added, and he shall possess the gate of his enemies. We see that the Messiah is going to be a deliverer. And this great promise, in your seed, all the nations of the earth will be blessed. We have a clear promise. The Messiah is no longer simply just the seed of the woman. The Messiah will be the seed of Abraham. And I believe we've looked at this passage before, and we will look at it again. This is one of the key passages in the book of Hebrews in this regard, where we see Genesis 3, Genesis 22 put together in beautiful harmony. Genesis 2:14 through 16, inasmuch then as children have partaken of flesh and blood, he himself likewise shared in the same. Okay. Seed of the woman. Why is he the seed of the woman? The children have partaken of flesh and blood. He also shared in the same. That through death he might destroy him who had the power of death, that is the devil. He crushed Satan's head. But how did he do it? Through death. Satan crushed his heel, and the very act of Satan crushing his heel was the act in which Christ crushed his head. And what was the result? He destroyed him and released those who through fear of death were all their lifetime subject to bondage. For indeed, and that this is the Old King James, which is the best translation of this particular verse 16, he took not on him the nature of angels, but he took on him the seed of Abraham. It's not just saying that Christ aided the children of Abraham. He is the seed of Abraham. God had promised that the Messiah was going to come through Abraham's loins. Jesus Christ was the seed of Abraham. All right, so what have we seen in the Abrahamic covenant? First of all, we saw federal headship. God tells Abraham that he will become the father of a great nation and that his descendants will inherit Canaan. Abraham is the federal head of this covenant. God said, to your offspring I will give this land. Participation in these promises depends on whether you are encompassed by the federal headship of Abraham. So relation to Abraham is the basis for membership or participation in this covenant. Infants are not commanded to be circumcised because their parents are believers, but because they are descended from and therefore related to Abraham. Now, it's so obvious on the face of it, but it needs to be understood because it's a presupposition against this in a typical Paedo-Baptist arguing for infant baptism. Because I can't tell you how many times believers were commanded to circumcise their children, and so we have to baptize ours. And there are a number of problems with that argument, but the number one is they were not commanded to circumcise their children because their parents were believers. Circumcision was because of their relationship to their Abraham, not the spiritual state of their parents. When they brought their child to the 8th day, the priest didn't ask them, "Are you, his parents, trusting in the Messiah to come?" before circumcised. No, they came, they're the children of Abraham, they've got a child of Abraham to be circumcised. It's the relationship to Abraham is the basis for being in this covenant. We see inheritance of Canaan. This covenant creates the nation of Israel and provides the realm in which they will live. God establishes the nation through whom the Messiah will come and provides a land in which they may dwell and be ruled over by their own kings. What about nationalism? The nationalistic pride that develops among the people of Israel, in which they look down on every other nation, was not in line with this covenant. From the beginning, the promise was that through Abraham, all the nations of the world would be blessed. The nationalistic pride that developed was not caused by the covenant itself. It was actually very contrary to it, because one of the primary promises of this covenant, it's at the beginning, in you all the nations of the earth, at the end, in your seed all the nations of the earth will be blessed. They should never have been looking down on all the other nations of the earth. Because the greatest promise is that through them, all of these nations would be blessed. Israel's Messiah was never intended for Israel alone, but for all the nations of the world. We saw that it was progressively revealed. It was initiated in Genesis 12, confirmed in Genesis 15. The covenant sign came in Genesis 17. The sanctions and the sign come long after the covenant was initiated. The promise of nations and tribes was followed by the promise of royalty. Not only would God make a nation from Abraham's seed, the nation would be governed by their own ruling kings. Circumcision. Infants were considered members of the covenant and given the sign of the covenant, not because they were born from believing parents, but because of their relationship to Abraham, the federal head of the covenant. I feel silly sometimes how often I repeat things, but there are certain things that I find that don't sink in right away, so I repeat them a lot. So if I seem repetitive to you, I apologize, but I've found it necessary. Okay, now you notice I begin a lot of lessons with Sam Renihan quotes, and I end almost every lesson with Sam Renihan quotes. Here's a nice, long, but very good, talking about the fulfillment and blessings of this covenant. The apparent tension between God's guaranteed promises and the threats of expulsion from the kingdom for disobedience is resolved in that although the promises were nationally guaranteed, they were not individually guaranteed. God kept his promises. God kept his promises. Abraham's descendants did multiply. They did inherit Canaan. The promised seed was born, but not every Israelite enjoyed the full benefits of God's blessings. They did not fulfill their commitments. The promises were nationally guaranteed, but not individually guaranteed. The wilderness generation and Moses are good examples of this. The wilderness generation did not enter Canaan because of their disbelief at the first arrival. Moses did not enter the promised land because he disobeyed God's command about speaking to the rock and struck it instead. Yet God fulfilled his promises corporately and nationally to Israel, though individuals cut themselves off from the covenant through unfaithfulness. The Bible itself declares that God discharged his duties and fulfilled his obligations completely. The Abrahamic covenant includes sanctioned commitments for both God and the offspring of Abraham. Both sides must keep their commitments, and sanctions guarantee their participation. But from man's perspective, the principle that governs enjoyment of the blessings of the covenant is obedience to a positive command. God will not fail to fulfill his promises, but the Israelites must not fail to persevere. Consequently, this covenant can be classified as a covenant based on works or obedience. God kept all his promises and fulfilled all his commitments. The covenant was realized in full, but all lack of an enjoyment and fulfillment stemmed from the unfaithfulness of the covenant people in their covenant God. So, on the one hand, God made these promises, and he said, may I be cut in two if they don't come to pass. And of course, he brought them all to pass. But each generation of Israelites had to make, are they going to follow God and receive the blessings of this covenant themselves, or they're going to reject God? Will they be the generation that's cast out of the land for unbelief, or will they be a generation that keeps the covenant? So this is why it's difficult to answer the question, is the Abrahamic covenant a covenant of works or a covenant of grace? On the one hand, God fulfills his promises to raise up a nation from Abraham, give them a land, preserve them until the Messiah comes through them, regardless of the obedience of the people. So in that sense, it looks like a covenant of grace. God's not, if this nation stays faithful, I'll bring the Messiah through them. That's not the covenant. The covenant is God says, I'm going to do it, and he did it. But on the other hand, the personal enjoyment of any of these blessings for individuals and families depends on obedience to God's commands. So each individual in this covenant, if they're going to themselves receive the blessings of this covenant, they must obey. And so there is definitely a sense in which it is a covenant of works, and not just a covenant of grace, and certainly not the covenant of grace. So what is its relationship to the new covenant or the covenant of grace? It is subservient, is the term that I'd never heard until the Cox Owen book came out. But it was commonly used by our particular Baptist forefathers. It's subservient. It serves the covenant. It is not the covenant of grace. It serves the covenant of grace. It's subservient to it. It's below it, but serves it. This covenant promises to provide one who will bless the world. The scriptures reveal that the blessings for the world is the new covenant. Okay? What is the great blessing of the world that comes through Abraham? It is the Messiah. And the Messiah's great work of redemption is his work as mediator of the new covenant. The benefits of Jesus Christ's salvific life, death, and resurrection are made available to all the world through the new covenant. So from its inception, the Abrahamic covenant is not just anticipating the new covenant, but carrying it within itself. And this is another Sam Renihan quote. The old covenant is pregnant with the new covenant. It promises the new covenant because it promises the mediator of the new covenant to be born from their midst. The Abrahamic covenant provides Christ. Christ provides the new covenant. The purpose of the Abrahamic covenant is to bring the new covenant into existence by bringing its founder, head, and mediator into existence. In conclusion, in successive stages, God made a covenant with Abraham, promising him that his multiplied offspring would inherit Canaan and live there under their own rulers after a period of several hundred years of sojourning in slavery. God will assuredly make this happen. As for Abraham and his descendants, they must keep the covenant by circumcising their males on the 8th day. If they do not keep the covenant, they will be disinherited not as a nation, but as individuals. From among the children of Abraham, one of them will bring a blessing for all the families of the earth, for all the nations. And, no hymn of the month? Okay, so we have 4 minutes for questions.
Just real quick, that was a really good point that you made about how the people look down on other nations because of the coming from Abraham. And we even had a discussion about this last week. And I'm always reminded what the interaction between the Jews and Jesus was in John chapter 8, verse 39. They answered, which is the Jews, and said to him, Jesus, Abraham is our father. Jesus said to them, if you're Abraham's children, you would do the deeds of Abraham. So not only the fact they were looking down on other nations, they were looking down on the Messiah himself. And it was that bad of their pride of nationalism, as you pointed it out. So that's a great point.
And I mean, next week, as we look at Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, see, yes, it's true that Abraham is the federal head of this covenant, and therefore the basis of participation in it is being descended from Abraham. But God does a lot to say, hey, don't trust in your relationship with me simply because you're his children. And that's what I'll keep myself from diving in right now, but that's what we're going to start seeing a lot next week.
So he says, in the new covenant, I will put my law in their inward parts and write it in their hearts. And obviously the Presbyterians believe this is just one arcing covenant starting with Abraham, right? In what sense was his law in their hearts, the ones who did believe at that point?
In the new covenant sense, everyone who actually trusted the Messiah to come had received every promise in the new covenant. It hadn't been ratified as a covenant yet, but it stood as a promise, the promise of the Messiah, and everyone who was trusting in that Messiah had the law written on their hearts. They knew God in a saving way. They had their sins forgiven. But it's only those who are trusting the Messiah to come. That's what. Yeah, you can point to people. There are many in the covenant with Abraham who were trusting the Messiah to come and had all these new covenant blessings, but it's not all of them. And so that's why we can't. And so, the point to people saved by faith in Christ back in this covenant, therefore this covenant must be the covenant of grace. That's not the answer. Isn't that this covenant is the covenant of grace? It's that everything at this point, the covenant, as far as salvation is concerned, is pointing forward to the covenant of grace, which needs Jesus Christ as its mediator and surety to actually save anyone. Anyone else? All right. Like I said, if anybody ever wants any of my PowerPoints or charts or anything, I know some people have asked me, and the following day my brain couldn't remember who it was. So my email is admin@cbtseminary.org. I'm happy to share absolutely anything that I have with you. See you next Sunday.